Welcome. My name is Amy Bays. I'm the teen librarian here at Maplewood Library, and I'm very pleased that the Teen Advisory Board was able to put together this hour of time with Swati Avasthi, who is going to tell us a little bit about Chasing Shadows and about writing and answer any questions that we might have today about authorship and her books and where we fit into the world of writing. So we're very excited. Thank you very much for coming out.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Hey. So this is my second book, Chasing Shadows. It came out earlier this year. It is, I don't know if you have seen it yet, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it first. It is about three very close friends, Holly, Corey, and Savitri. Holly and Corey are twins. Savitri and Holly have been best friends since they were in the second grade, and Corey and Savitri have been dating for a year. So this trio is very tight. They're also free runners. Do you guys know what that is? Oh, look at this. Do you? This is awesome because everybody I talk to, for the most part, are like, no, what's that? It's the, so for those of you who don't know, it's the same thing as parkour, and it's the very cool things that some athletes can do where they treat the urban playground like or the urban environment like a playground, and they will do gymnastic moves throughout it. They'll do things like leap off of one-story buildings and roll so that they don't break their ankles, and they survive just fine. They do that and they run off, okay? So these are pretty athletic, strong people. And Holly it makes her feel most like a superhero, which is what she really loves. So all of them feel invincible, they all feel strong. What happens is that that they are out of the blue sort of shot, and one of them is killed. And Savitri and Holly have to figure out how to put the pieces back together in the wake of Corey's death. And also, because it was a murder, Holly decides that she wants to go try to solve the murder since the police are having no trouble, and her father's a police officer. So she figures she has inside information. So that's kind of the basis of the story. I came to it really from three different ways. The most important probably being my own personal history with it, which is what most people want to know about when I start talking about a book first, which is that when I was 18, I found out on the news that a friend of mine from middle school was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting. I went to a school where that was incredibly unexpected. It just was not the kind of thing that we would have ever anticipated would come into our world. So it was maybe the first time I realized how precarious life can be, and how we are in fact always insecure in our safety. And that was a moment for me where words left me. You know that moment of shock that you have sometimes and you just can't speak at all? So that was sort of what happened for me in that moment. And I was trying to figure out how to capture that vicarious break from language, which is hard to do when you're writing because it, requires language. So I was trying to get people to feel the same way about that idea of what it means when language fails. So what happened was I decided to change and go into visuals, which became a graphic novel. So there's a graphic novel inside this. So that's when they first see the gun. And then I don't know if you guys can see it, but that's when they're shot, right? And then part of the book, as I said, stays in graphics, which reflects Holly's mindset. She starts to think in pictures in addition to words after this. And so it's kind of this idea of different states of consciousness. There are times when words flow, and whenever she feels like she's in a different sort of state of being, she narrates in graphics. So if you read it, you'll understand the code for what I'm trying to say. But I'm trying to do it without spoilers, as I said, so it makes it a little harder. But there's a pattern for why we go into graphics at certain times. And it's a big spoiler for why, so I can't really tell you. It's kind of one of the things we find out at the end of the book. Let's see. Should we start with questions? Actually, I wanted to be an author when I was 5, and I read Little House in the Big Woods. Do you guys remember that with Laura Ingalls Wilder? Okay, so she was this spunky girl who had an older sister who she thought was perfect, and I related to that. And you know, my older sister was sort of demure and would always do what was expected of her, and I was the kind of girl who would stuff as many pebbles in my pockets as I could until they split open the way that it did for Laura. And so I related to her, and I thought in my 5-year-old logic, well, she's a writer because she actually authored those books. So clearly that's what I should be too, because I'm like her. Ignoring, you know, really other big important things like she lived 150 years before me. She was white, I'm not. She's, you know, part of a pioneer family, all these different kinds of things. But I think that's what happens when we find ourselves in books. We find the personality more than we find these extra sort of layers that do inform the person, but we find the personality. So I started writing when I was 5, and I continued until I was about 16. And then my oldest sister graduated from college. And when she did that, I realized that there's, you know, this thing called money that writers can't make. And I was going to have to do that pretty shortly. And so I thought, well, I can't make a living at this. So I left the world of writing for, I guess it was about 15 years, pursuing other careers, doing other things. None of which were really taking particularly well. I mean, I was doing fine. I really loved what I was doing, but I didn't stay in them. So I did theater for about 3 years professionally. Then I left and I did the law for about 3 or 4 years. Went to law school, had a kid, and my kid didn't really like the fact that I was in law school, so he was not up for that. So I said, okay. And I left, and I thought, well, you know, for the first time, I'm not making money anyway. So this is my chance. So I started writing again, and really writing. And I wrote, I was telling you, a fantasy novel that was 100,000 words. I wrote it 5 times, and it still was awful. So I didn't try to get it published because I knew it wasn't the way I wanted it. And then I started writing contemporary realism for a contest. There was a contest. I went, oh, it's 1,200 words, I'll try it. And I could feel like my voice kind of opened up in contemporary realism in a way that I felt the language was less accessible to me in fantasy. So at about that time, I received an award for writing, and I was about to go back to law school, and I called up my husband and I said, how do you feel about me getting an MFA rather than a JD? And he was like, good, go for it. So that was what I did. And then I wrote Split, which was my first published novel. It came out in 2010. And then this is the second one. So working at it. I am loquacious, as you may have guessed. That's why it's so amazing when language leaves me, because that's all I do is talk. Somebody else had a question. This idea of outlining. I know a few points in the novels that I want to get to, and I know where I'm starting. I think I have my climax, but I haven't been right yet as to what my climax actually is. Because as I go along, I learn more and more about the characters, and I learn more and more about the story. And it's that process of discovery that I find really fun in the first draft, that if I tried to stick to an outline, I think would rob me of the pleasure. But then it's, and I think this is true for most people, then the first draft is really ugly. It's really ugly. And I don't share it with anybody because it doesn't even usually make very much sense. For instance, in this book, when I started it, Savitri had a 2-year-old brother. The book takes place over 3 months. By the end of the book, he was 25. this obviously makes no logical sense. So if somebody tried to read it for me, they would have, these glaring problems that it's too hard to look past if you're trying to get feedback. What I learned is that represents my instincts. My instincts were, and Savitri, by the way, in the final draft doesn't even have a brother, but my instincts were that she needed someone to protect at the beginning. And by the end, she needed someone she could look up to. So then I started thinking, who could really achieve that without creating multiple characters, more characters than are needed to tell the story? And Holly sort of became the person that she was always protecting, and her mom actually became the person who was wise and could give her direction. And it's funny because one of the things you learn as a writer for young adults is you never have the parents solve the problems. In fact, you want to offstage them as much as possible. I know one of my writer friends, Phyllis Root, was in a group called Kill the Mothers. Because you just don't want them to solve problems. So that was a really fine balance for me, where she could never solve a problem for Savitri, but could act as someone who knew a little bit more. The other problem for me with that was that I think when we kill off all the parents, that's a fine technique. It works really well. But it also doesn't represent the way that teenagers deal with their parents. They're not gone. They're not dead. I assume not all of you have dead parents. I'm sorry if I just insulted you. But usually there's one parent or force of stability in a teenager's life. And that doesn't mean that we use them, though. My parents are really, really good parents. They're really stellar. And I thought so the entire time I was growing up. But I didn't go to them with my problems. It just would have never occurred to me to do that. So that was kind of the way that I situated her, as someone who was there, who could be full of advice, but wasn't gonna, Savitri isn't gonna go talk to her for the most part. Parents, for me, when I was a teen, they were around when I needed them, but for the most part, I kind of dismissed them, and I did my own thing. So that's kind of the way I was trying to do it. So my process is one, that was the original question, tangent. My process is one where I have a few points that I know that I'm going to. I write towards those points, huge mess, and then I start the revision. And that's a lot of time. That's much more time than the writing for me, because I make such a big mess. So I could say more, but I think maybe I should move on.
I have a good question off of that. Down and I'd start writing down on my days.
I think one of the things I've learned is that I have a pattern for when I write. When I'm writing it, it sounds brilliant. I'm like, oh, this is great. And then I put it away for a while and I read it and I'm in total depths of despair going, this is terrible. This is like schlock. Understanding that is my pattern has helped me deal with it. Of going, I write when I'm sort of feeling great and then I'm really depressed and then I feel great. And it's like, okay, that's surface. And the whole trajectory of the novel, those are just waves. And so I don't worry about it so much anymore. That said, that sounds good, but until you've experienced it, it's hard to be there. I think the other thing I do is I try to give myself permission to make it really messy. Because I think that if I don't, I stifle those creative impulses, like Savitri needing someone to protect and then needing someone to advise her, which is something that I wouldn't have known unless I'd let myself be really, really messy. So I try to forgive myself, is what I'm getting at. Just saying, okay, it's all right that it's messy. It will get better. All I've done is given myself a place to start. So that's kind of how I do it, is this faith that it's gonna get better if I revise. So I hope that'll work for you.
Yeah, go first. It just gives you routine after a while, 'cause I just sit.
I don't really like to, but yes, I do. I don't like to because I write fiction partly because I don't love to write creative nonfiction. I like having a little distance between me and the person I'm writing about. I think that if I try to write myself on the page, I become very self-conscious. And the more that I can inhabit the character and the less that it's about me, the better. So I try not to take my own traits and put them on the page. I'm not sure that that's actually the way it happens. I believe that everybody has the capacity to feel certain ways. And it's like you dial up certain things emotionally to hit, or in terms of characteristics, to hit a different character. So, or another way of thinking of it is every time I write and I'm trying to think about a moment of panic, it's always about the breath. In fact, almost everything I do on my first draft is about breathing. And I have asthma. So even though my characters may be doing things that I'm not trying to keep them like me, I think there are connections there, right? I do it for other characters, though. I don't do it for my protagonists. I write in first person for the most part. But yeah, there are some that I've just wholly stolen from other people. Just like, okay, you would fit really well if I did this to you. So let me put you in a situation and see what happens. I found my editor, well, I found my agent first. I found it through my agent, who I love, whose name is Rosemary Stamola. She's fabulous. She only represents books for kids. I found her on a website called Publishers Marketplace. It is a website, you can subscribe to their Publishers Lunch feature, which allows you to search their website for agents. There are other ways. I chose to invest that way. It's $20 a month. I did all my research in a month. I spent my $20 and then I cut off my subscription. I went to a conference called SCBWI. It's a very long name. They have a conference every August, and I went out there and I met a bunch of writers. I met some agents. One of the writers there said to me, I think, she just got an agent. She said, I think you should definitely query Rosemary Stamola. So she was the first query I actually sent out. I came back and I queried her. She was so fast in her reply. She took a week and then said, here are some edits I'd like you to try. And then resubmit to me. So I did that. It took about a month for me to do the edits. Again, she took a week and she offered me a contract. That is not typical. Most of my friends, it's like 18 months to get an agent. So it is very atypical. In the meantime, I had other agents who were looking at it, but not a lot. And then I had a very atypical story also for the publication, which is that it sold really fast. She sold it in 3 weeks. Again, very atypical. And it went to auction, which was like, I don't know, Cloud 9 looked very small from where I was. So there were, and that means that 3 houses wanted the book, or a number of houses. In my case, it was 3. She submitted to 5 places. 3 people came back with an offer. And I was just totally ecstatic, but overwhelmed, and I'm so glad I had my agent to walk me through that process. Agents generally take 15% of anything that you make. For me, that is money well spent. She negotiated my contracts. She negotiated them up by 15% at least. She earned her money, no doubt for me. She has helped me in a number of ways in dealing with my publisher. She also found my editor. She advised me when it came to, she's like, this is your choice. I think these are 2 that we're really serious about. You do your homework, I'll do mine. We went and did it and then came back both coming up with the same idea of which house we wanted to go with, Random House. So it worked out really well. She's great. I mean, and I love my editor too, who I think is fabulous. And she's Nancy Sisko at Knopf. This book would not have happened without her. Split was a much easier road for publication. It was a much easier novel to publish because there was no graphics in it, right? So this isn't common. So we had to figure out how to do it. We started working on this 5 years ago. So it took a long time to work it out. And she was really instrumental to figure out how to put a book together like this. You guys are already working on it. You're in high school. You know what I mean? Like, you have to figure it out. It doesn't matter where you are. All the circumstances in your life will change. Of course they will. That changes as you grow up. It changes as you have children. It changes because your job changes. You know, everything about it changes. The thing that you can control is whether or not you can sit down at the page. And even if that means 10 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day, that's the one thing that you can actually do. I think it's really important for me to separate all the flutter and chaos that's in my life from the writing as much as I can. So I have sort of a ritual for what I like to do to set myself up to write. And I do have, Starbucks is my, drug of choice. So I always get a particular drink from Starbucks. So I have that, I get something to eat usually from Starbucks, and I put my headphones on and I listen to music that I've created for the book while I write. And by that I mean a playlist that I've made up for the book. For my first novel, Split, there's a scene that's really, it's a book about domestic violence, and there's one scene that's graphically violent. And I had a song from Eminem the whole time I was writing it. I just put it on repeat. I followed the one that's working for me at the time. The one that says you have to force yourself to write, even when you don't want to, is the one that I use when I don't want to write. The one that says go to the keyboard when you're excited is the one that I use when I'm excited to write. So I try to get myself to write every day. I'm not someone who succeeds at that. I tell my students to do it because I think it's a good habit to be in. The more you access and work your right brain, the easier it is to access and work it. So I try to give myself 5 minutes a day at least, and I have a bunch of character exercises. So I'll pull out a character exercise and I'll do it for 5 minutes. So even on the days when I'm like, oh, forget it, there's no way, I'll just pull it out and I'll do the character exercise for 5 minutes so that I can feel like I am still in touch with the book. Otherwise I can feel like I get away from the book too much. So that's my actual goal when I'm teaching. I don't even do that all the time. My real advice is to be bold and brave and write every day you can. So that is what I actually do. Until I wrote this book, I really had the impression that I hated research. And as I started doing research, I started to realize that I liked it, because all it was for me was finding out things that I needed to know to write the book, which I found interesting. So for that reason, I found it much more fun than I expected. I also found that I like to talk to people. That's one of my favorite ways to get any information. So I had been really shy and hesitant to call people up and say, can I interview you about this? And I had to get over that to write this book. And I was surprised by how forthcoming people are. It was wonderful. I had so many good interviews. One of the things I really love about writing accurately is that there's so much drama in what's real that it's usually better than anything I can make up anyway. So if I can get all the details right, there's all these opportunities for people to react to what's actually going to happen. So that's what I prefer. I was saying earlier that I have not written a book in a place that I haven't lived yet. I think book 3 is going to be set in Seattle, where I've never lived. Just because it's another layer of things I have to research. And I don't want to get it wrong. I really don't want that moment where a reader looks at a book and they go, no, that's on the other side of the street, or whatever it is. And they have that moment, they have to come out of the world that I'm writing about and sort of correct it and then come back in. John Gardner, who has written a number of books, a lot of authors read his book about the art of fiction. He calls it a vivid and continuous dream. And that's what we're all going for. We're trying to create this vivid and continuous dream for the reader. that's that's why I do as much research as I do. I find it helps me create moments and scenes, and because I am sort of worried that I could get it wrong, and I don't want to get it wrong. Yes, I've gotten stuck very many times when I write. Actually, what I usually do is I back up. Usually the reason I can't get to the place I'm trying to is because 1 or 2 steps before I took a misstep. And I don't know where it is or what I've done. But that means that I can't write that bridge to the next piece. So, or the next piece might be wrong, or the piece before it might be wrong. So I have to back up a little. And then I just rewrite it. I just rewrite the scene without looking at it. So I take out a new piece of paper and I write it again. Or in my case, a new document, because I write on the computer. Whenever a character can surprise me while I'm writing, I know I've got the book. As soon as they surprise me, it's like, oh, I've got it. I know these characters well enough that they feel like they're whole-rounded people. And it feels like they can make decisions that I hadn't planned. And plot-driven novels are usually, I think, more about getting a character from A to B. And you need B to happen so the plot works, right? As opposed to letting the character go where they want, which will create a plot. I try to create characters who feel like they have their own voices. So if you read Chasing Shadows, it's narrated by 2 girls, one's Holly, one's Savitri. And I think the way they speak is very different, the way they narrate. I worked hard to try to make sure they were different so that you wouldn't have to go, wait, who's narrating this while you're in the middle of the section? I don't know whether it worked, but that was what I was going for. And it was hard for me to develop their voices as really different because it was so much easier for me to be, I'm actually an incredibly sarcastic person. And so it's hard for me to be not that. I still read picture books because I love them. I actually think the idea of being too young for a book is a teacher idea because we want people to grow up and be able to read different kinds of books. But, I encourage you not to look at it as a sophistication idea in terms of the literature because if you read Where the Wild Things Are, when you get to college, if you look at it again, you'll find that there are 100 different ways to read that book. And the more sophisticated you are as a reader, the better the book is, which is actually what I think is most interesting about children's lit. If you're a super sophisticated reader, the books are, to me, even better. Where the Wild Things Are, you can talk about it through a feminist lens, through a colonial lens very easily. You can talk about it through all these different ways of analyzing and looking at the text. And eventually what's so fun about that book, in my opinion, is that it actually teaches the parents a lesson and it doesn't teach the kids anything, which I think is brilliant. I don't think that we have to teach kids. The needle for people who are in books that are diverse has not changed in at least 20 years. We have not increased the number of representation of people of color. On the other hand, our population has changed tremendously. So next year, 50% of school kids will be of color. So as a person of color, I told you about how much I loved Little House on the Prairie, which I did, and I still do. But I will say that what I didn't realize I was doing at age 5 was erasing my racial identity so that I could relate to this character. I have been taught all my life to read into a white person. I have read very few books that help me read into an Indian person's identity. And it devalues, even if you don't want it to. It does devalue my heritage. I know that for myself. I don't think that you guys want to hear about it. I don't know if it's true, but it's not out there in the public all the time. So I assume it's not something anybody's interested in hearing about. And when you don't get the mirror for who you are, you start to devalue that in yourself. And that becomes really painful eventually, right? So the first time I read something, I was about 30, when I read about a first generation Indian person. It was Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake, which was made into a movie, you guys know it. And I found myself at 30, sneaking away, away from my in-laws' Thanksgiving to read it, because it was so delicious, and crying while I was reading it because it was also so painful to realize how much I'd missed my whole life and realize there was this big gap in the support of myself in a certain way. Every time I've written a book, there is a choice. This is the other thing that I think people miss. So Split is narrated by a 16-year-old white boy, and I've told you that it's a book about domestic violence. And so it sounds, to most people, they'll say to me things like, it's so interesting that you chose not to write about race. And I'm like, no, I did. I chose to write about race. White is not default. I made a choice because I didn't want the typical media representation that we see all the time, that domestic violence is a person of color problem, when it's not. It's, all the statistics indicate that it has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with social class. So I really wanted to set that problem in the world of a boy, a white, rich boy, so that we could look at it, just as the domestic violence in a way. And this book is partly the characters, one of them is white and one of them is Indian. And that was really important to me as well. It's really important, I think, when you start taking on the point of view of a different culture, that you do a lot of good research to be able to do it, and that you're really honest with how that might come about. I think that's why we see so many representations of the friend who's a person of color, because we have so many white writers. And so we want, you know what I mean? It's like, I don't know that I want to inhabit that. And so people put them as the friend. But I really encourage you to, because you're young, because you're in a position where you probably know a lot of people of color and you've grown up with a more diverse community, that you push beyond that. It's really important to, as you were saying, represent our whole world and not just a slice of it. So we get to create culture. That's the cool thing we get to do. So, create it wisely. With great power comes great responsibility.
Those are good.
Go. All right. Well, thank you very much for asking and for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yay.